Hey guys, it's Bree. I hope you're having a fantastic reading week. I am just wrapping up my Friday and it has been beautiful. I got to spend some really lovely time out in the garden and have been really enjoying that. And today I wanted to talk to you about one of my favorite short stories. Ursula K. LeGuin originally wrote The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas in the 1970s, and it was published in a large anthology by Robert Silverberg. It's been republished many times since and is, I would say, a staple of science fiction. And in fact, I would say this is such a classic that it is one of the stories that you are most likely to come across if you have not really been a science fiction and fantasy reader. My first ever interaction with Ursula Le Guin was through this story, and it was so impactful for me at the time. I was a freshman in college in a philosophy class, and it was the first time that I think it was really posed to me explicitly that science fiction could be a vehicle for really intentional reflection on the world. Before that, I'd always grown up with science fiction, but it was largely in the form of television, and I was maybe a little bit too young to really understand the implications of some of what I was watching. I was a really big reader, but I read a lot of fantasy, and that's what I enjoyed. It never occurred to me before that that science fiction might be something that I wanted to explore in literature as a medium. And so I guess in a lot of ways, this was a story that changed my reading life. And I'm so glad it did. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a really short story. It's something like 20 pages. It takes less than an hour and a half to read. It is that short. And it really packs a punch for all that it is a very quick read. And I think it's worth unpacking in a lot of ways. Now, in a lot of times, you're going to see this story and the explicit conversation that's had about it is one about utilitarianism, because that is the premise of the story in a lot of ways. Utilitarianism is a moral and ethical philosophy that was initially founded in its modern form by Jeremy Bentham and then later John Stuart Mill. And it explores the idea of how to decide which action and how to kind of break away from the traditional Aristotelian versus, well, hedonistic models of thought. It proposes that when choosing an action, you should choose the action that does the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. In a lot of ways, it looks at morality as a kind of calculus of the good. What can you do? Who can you impact? And is that going to create more harm or more good in the world? It's a really intuitive philosophy, and so you'll find that a lot of the founding documents about it, things like on utilitarianism, are really quite short. I think that's what makes it in a lot of ways very appealing, but it also has a lot of, shall we say, brutal interpretations. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a story about a perfect city. It's beautiful, the people there are well fed, healthy, happy, and then you find out that it is all predicated upon the perpetual pain of a child. This one child who is locked away in a basement, who is treated harshly and beaten, and that if that child were ever given even one kind word, Omelas would no longer have happiness in the same form. Every person, as they come into the age of majority, is required to go and see this child. And for the most part, they live with it and they're happy. They continue to live a life of joy. But every once in a while, there are ones who walk away. There are a lot of really interesting things to unpack here, and we'll talk about utilitarianism first, but I'll be mentioning some of the other bigger themes that I think are important that get overlooked as well in a couple of minutes. One of the classic ways that people encounter utilitarianism and utilitarian thought is through something called the trolley problem. You've probably heard it. Basically, the trolley problem says, you are the conductor of a train. There is a split in the track. If you pull the lever, you divert the train onto a track that has one person on it. If you do not divert the lever, you hit 5 people. Guaranteed, whichever track you pick, someone dies. What do? The trolley problem has a lot of different iterations. One of them, you have to push someone onto the track to stop the train. In others, you're no longer on a train, you're instead a surgeon deciding how to how to go about getting the organs that you need for other people to live. And essentially the variation in them always comes down to a couple of different ideas. One is the closeness with which you are to the problem. So the more involved you become, the harder it is for people to make the decision to begin with. If you are actually pushing someone onto the track to save the 5 people, a lot more people are reluctant to push the person onto the track. For instance, in the surgeon example, if you are choosing between killing 1 patient and saving 10 with their organs, that in and of itself is really difficult because you're going ahead and you're choosing to interact to cut open another person. And then the other element of it is that the level of acuteness of the pain, how intense the pain is, tends to have a factor on how people decide. So for instance, if the problem is you break someone's leg or 5 people die, you are much more likely to go ahead and say, yes, let's break someone's leg. It is significantly less likely that you choose an option that's like, let's paralyze someone or 5 people die. It's mostly a level of how close are you willing to get and how intense is the issue. The trolley problem is one of those fundamental questions that you get asked in like your very intro philosophy class. It's meant to make you think more than it is to give you a guiding answer. It's meant to have you engage with the thought process behind decision making, behind pain, behind how we prioritize life, happiness, and general well-being. With all of the variations, I would say that this particular iteration of the trolley problem, the story of Omelas, is one of the most acute and one of the most distinct. You have to go and beat this child. You have to treat them like absolute crap. You have to starve them, make them hurt, stunt them intellectually and physically, so thousands of people can be happy. It is both very robust in its impact. It is very thought-provoking and engaging and shocking. It also does what a lot of iterations of the trolley problem do. It ignores some of the broader social implications of what you're doing. For instance, if you live in a world where someone regularly has to choose between killing 1 person and killing 5 on a trolley track, you're gonna have a lot fewer people becoming trolley engineers, a lot fewer people then being able to transport their goods, a lot fewer people actually being able to get the goods that they need to survive, and thus a lot more people starving. There are broader implications to the decision-making process that the trolley problem doesn't necessarily explore, and Omelas has some of these same issues. For instance, why would you ever have a child if they could possibly be the child who's locked up in the basement? Utilitarianism struggles with being simultaneously one of the most effective philosophies and also kind of one of the most edgelord philosophies. It's one of those things where like you are very likely to hear a 14-year-old be like, yeah, dude, I'm a utilitarian, and not really understand what that means. And at the same time, the entire process of policy making, the entire process of deciding what is a good for society is in a lot of ways a utilitarian issue. You are deciding how to benefit the most amount of people and to what extent you are willing to harm others to get everyone else in a good spot. I won't lie, I kind of have a weakness for the trolley problem, and I also was a 14-year-old edgelord, so. I think though that there are 2 very important issues that often get overlooked when people read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. First and foremost, I think it has a lot to say about the way LeGuin sees humanity's perceptions of happiness. There's a lot of the story that builds at the very beginning on this idea that you're not believing what I'm saying. She's building this picture of the perfect society and continues iterating with, you can't believe this is real because there's no pain in this world, right? So what she's fundamentally getting down to is this idea that we juxtapose happiness and joy with pain, and that we cannot imagine a world where they are not explicitly both present. That for there to be an up, there has to be a down, and we have created that same relationship with joy and pain. In a way, it's kind of an indictment of the way that we propose utopian societies can exist, but then simultaneously turn around and say, you can't have a perfect world. There's a lot to unpack there that I think probably would take more than a video. You'd probably have to do a series to unpack LeGuin's philosophy about joy in the utopian world. Maybe I'll do that one day. It sounds like a really big undertaking. And I think the other really important thing that often gets overlooked is the idea that the people who are walking away from Omelas are maybe also not making the right decision. So there are these people who can't handle it, right? They go and they see this child in pain. Their heart hurts for this child. They cannot fathom that they live in a world where everyone's happiness depends on this child's suffering, and perpetual suffering at that. And so they leave. And on its face, this seems like a much more tolerable option, right? They leave and they are no longer partaking in a society in which these terrible things are happening. But the underlying issue is that that child is still in pain, and they have done nothing to actually relieve that suffering. Instead, they have continued to let the society's happiness depend upon perpetual suffering. And by doing so, are complicit in the fact that it still exists. In a lot of ways, this reflects the way that voters behave. If you live in a society that's, say, heavily Democratic or heavily Republican, and you have that opposite belief, you're pretty likely to move. And while that might give you the benefit of doing something, of living in a place that agrees with you, that doesn't necessarily relieve the stresses that the policies you disagree with cause on the people who you left behind. In a lot of ways, the older I get, the more I see walking away as a fundamentally unethical choice in and of itself. You are letting harm continue to persist for your own comfort, for your own desire to not have conflict. And I think that that's an idea that people don't, generally speaking, think about when they read Omelas. I think they look at it as this, like, of course people would leave. Why would you want to live in that society? As opposed to saying, why weren't you the one person who just said the nice thing, right? Why were you not the person who stopped someone from hitting this child? And, you know, of the three options, participate in causing pain, leave and don't cause that pain directly, and stay and fight it, there are worse options to be made, right? Like, you could be the person who's kicking the child. But I don't find walking away to be satisfactory. And I think that's part of why the story is haunting. It sticks with me, and I think it's because as I age and the more times I read it, the more I read into this ethical consideration and the more complex the decision-making process becomes. I think that's a really big part of why this story continues to have the impact it does. And I am so impressed that somebody was able to convey that complex of a decision-making process in like 20 pages. Like, that's ridiculous. And something to which I think we can all aspire, that level of consideration and conciseness together. That's a skill. And I hope one day to develop it myself. As we all know, I'm verbose. Let me know when the first time you encountered the Omelas story was. Let me know if it's stuck with you. Thanks so much for watching, guys. You know the drill. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Head on over to my Twitter and Instagram to see what I'm up to in the meantime. And if you are so inclined, feel free to stop on by my Patreon. It's Bree Reads Books, where you can get things like early access to videos and help me pick out my reads for the month. Talk to you later. Bye.